Hi everyone. So for this week, what we're going to try to do is to give an overview of Leibniz's major systematic works. You'll notice that both of these are quite small. I mentioned that last week, and so they're very dense and difficult works, and a lot of what Leibniz is saying can sound a little wacky in some ways, but what I'm going to try to do this week is try to present what I take to be some of Leibniz's most important insights and try to give them a really sympathetic treatment. I'm going to try to show you that even some of the aspects of what Leibniz says that I think can come off to us as a little bit kooky or strange or science fiction are really interesting, important insights, and you can kind of see the relationship to his discovery of the calculus with his own philosophical vision about what substances are. And so, just to reiterate a couple of things from last week's video. One of the major things that we talked about in last week's video, which was from the conversation between Filarete and Ariste, is the nature of bodies as composites, right? This was implicit in Descartes' analysis. Descartes claimed that bodies essentially consist in extension, means that it is quantifiable, it can be divided, right? And so that means that it's an aggregate. It's a bunch of stuff sort of grouped together, right? And it can be further divided into its parts. Now, Leibniz made the claim in that essay that this disqualified bodies from legitimately being substances. I mean, just to consider the example that we were thinking about before, in terms of my mug, I mean, obviously, like I can smash the mug and then it's in a bunch of pieces, right? Descartes' point would be, hey, it's still taking up space, right? And so maybe you've destroyed it as a mode in terms of like as a specific way that the matter was organized, but you haven't destroyed the matter, right? Now, the way that Leibniz responds to this is to say that, well, I mean, the mug is a composite, right? It's a grouping of things that take up space, right? And so that grouping can be disturbed, it can be cut, it can be, disrupted, destroyed in all of these various sorts of ways, right? And so as a result, it just doesn't have the sort of independence that a substance does. And so this leaves Leibniz thinking about substances as like souls, right? Like in the sort of Cartesian tradition. But what makes Leibniz very interesting, though, is that Leibniz was one of the first Western philosophers that knew anything about microorganisms, right? And this was totally fascinating to Leibniz, right? Leibniz had this sort of image of the human body. We ourselves are composed of, trillions or billions, I don't know, of cells, a whole lot, right? And those cells in turn sort of have organelles, right? All of this kind of stuff. And so Leibniz was convinced that you could do this at any level of scale, right? And you would find complex interrelations about life, right? You would see that things that are conscious exist at every level of physical scale. And for Leibniz, they are the ultimate stuff of the universe. They are infinitesimally small because they're what bodies are composed of, right? But they themselves, don't take up space because they, cannot be divided into parts, right? In the same way that the continuity of the soul continues through the apparent death of the body, right? And so this is a very complicated image, right? Leibniz wants to think bodies are composites, right? And therefore, they're mere images or noumena, right? But the things that perceive those bodies are individual substances, what he will in the monadology call monads. Or in the Discourse on Metaphysics, he refers to them as a singular substance. And essentially, the entire rest of this lecture is going to be concerned with clarifying what it is that Leibniz means by a substance, a singular substance in the Discourse in Metaphysics, or a monad in the monadology. Because, it can be really, really tricky what he has in mind. And some of the things that he says, like I mentioned earlier, can appear a little kooky, if they are not taken in the way that he means them. Okay, so let's begin with simply thinking a little bit about the way that Leibniz understands metaphysics, right? Begin with the presupposition that human beings are finite. And part of what Leibniz means by this is that our perceptions are often confused and indistinct, right? We mentioned this earlier, right? If you think about your entire visual field, you're not aware of it all in its complexity, all at once, right? Certain things recede into the foreground and certain things recede into the background, right? There's certain kinds of things that you can see and certain things that you can't, right? We can't see at the microscopic level, right? And so this refers to a sort of limitation in our ability, in our senses, to render things clearly and distinctly. So what does that mean with regard to metaphysics? Well, metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. So it's the study of reality as it really is, right? Not reality as we are forced to perceive it as human beings, but the way that reality would be if we could understand it or perceive it in absolute clarity with absolute distinctness, right? And to know it at every level of scale and with complete detail, right? And you can kind of see, right, from that characterization that what Leibniz really thinks that metaphysics is about is embodying the perspective of God, namely to be able to try to tap into the perspective that we would have if we could see things with complete clarity and complete distinctness, right? And Leibniz is convinced that we have some capacity to do that, right? Because we can do that with mathematical truths, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4. Well, I can say with clarity and exactness why it equals 4 and why it doesn't equal any other number, right? I can say, why it is exactly 4 and not 4.1 or, any sort of gradation between what is exactly the right answer and what is not exactly the right answer. And these facts are facts that like we know with clarity, which means we know what they are, and we know with distinctness, and that we know exactly why it is one thing rather than another. Whereas, for example, our understanding of color as it comes from a visual field, right? Maybe we can know it with some degree of clarity, like I know that's a pink or I know that's a blue, right? But I don't know with complete distinctness because I don't know at what point on the gradient it goes from being blue to purple or purple to red or and so on. So my knowledge there, because it comes from the senses, is less clear and less distinct, right? Okay, so we've clarified that Metaphysics, which is the most fundamental discipline since it concerns the ultimate nature of reality, requires that we approach it with the maximal level of clarity and distinctness possible. This is sort of, held in common, I think, between all of the rationalists that we've discussed so far. But for Leibniz really thinks through the consequences of what it would mean to see the world through a God's eye perspective, right? And this really comes out in his description of what substances and monads are. I'm just going to call them monads, and I would encourage you all to do the same, just because this introduces some degree of clarity that we're talking about, like specifically Leibniz's conception of what a substance is, right? Because obviously we've gone through a lot of different conceptions of substance, and we're going to continue to do that the entire semester. Okay, so at this point, we know that Leibniz is engaging in a metaphysical inquiry. That for Leibniz, to engage in a metaphysical inquiry is to see things with maximal clarity and distinctness in order to encounter things as they actually are. And in that way, we seek for our own perception, for our own thoughts to mirror reality and therefore also the thoughts of God who created reality, right? And so essentially, we are trying to imagine what it would be like if we did not have the sort of limitations that human beings have, right? And so this is one reason why Leibniz will say things like, oh, well, this is only a nominal definition. We need a real definition, right? What he means by that is that what nominal definitions are is nominal definitions are stipulative, right? So what that means is they're just like for the purposes of knowing each other, right? We call each other we call each other by names, right? You don't instantaneously know everything about me, so you don't instantly know how to differentiate me from other people, right? So we come up with names for each other. You call me Penelope, I call you by your name, right? And this is meant as a sort of shorthand for all of the properties that we have. And we can see why this would be very helpful for human beings, right? Because we don't have immediate access to all of the information about the universe, so we need handy shortcuts, right? That's what nominal definitions are, handy shortcuts. But you can see from the description of metaphysics, as we've given it so far, why nominal definitions are never sufficient in this specific kind of inquiry. Because nominal definitions concern ways to make things more intelligible for creatures like us, right? They're handy, they're useful, right? Whereas metaphysics is supposed to be unconditional. It's supposed to be the way that reality really is, right? Not seen through a human finite perspective, but seen as it actually is, right? Okay. And so this is what is going to allow us to begin to understand why it is that uh, Leibniz frames his discussion about substances as he does, monads as he does. So on this left side of the board, the top says Leibniz's major systematic works, and on the left half, we're talking about the Discourse on Metaphysics, which was written in 1686 So this is really early. This is like Leibniz's first foray into systematic metaphysics, and it's like kind of the longest thing ultimately that he ends up writing. In some ways, he writes longer books and commentaries and stuff like that, but they're not as focused as this text is. Okay, so to begin with, Leibniz says, and this is around section 9 of the text, which is really, about 5 pages in. Leibniz says, from God's perspective, each subject, and you can also say substance, contains explicitly all of its predicates or properties. What does that mean? That means that if we could see everything that God sees, then we would know everything there is to know about that thing. So consider me as an example. Okay, consider Penelope. If God knew me, which for Leibniz, he would, of course, of course God knows you, right? It's a weird thought. Anyway, uh, for Leibniz, right? For every person that exists, God knows them completely, right? And knows them utterly and knows everything that will ever happen to them in the entire course of their lives from the beginning of time, right? God does not require events in the world to happen in order to know them, right? Imagine like a gigantic math equation with an infinite number of steps, right? God would be able to do that instantaneously. And that's sort of like the algorithm for the generation of the world, right? And, you can think of it, and this is why really Leibniz is the forefather of computer science, is because he thinks that God would sort of know everything basically as an enormous, infinitely long algorithm, right? That the world is sort of programmed according to a natural order, right? And that God knows what it is because he created it, right? And that program determines every dimension of everything that happens. And it's like God could choose between this algorithm, which is the one that he actually chose, or any number of other algorithms, right? And he chose this one. So he chose this world instead of any other one. And he did it knowing everything about what would happen to every person that would ever exist. Right? So that's kind of confusing, right? But we're gonna continue to meditate about this because I do think it is quite confusing and difficult, but it's rewarding to think about. But let's go again. Let's do it at a less high altitude level, right? You could pose it as a question like this, right? If God knew Penelope, right, and God knew Penelope in an absolutely perfect way, right, then God would also know that on this specific day that Penelope would be recording for her early modern philosophy class, right? And so in virtue of knowing those facts about me, Leibniz says, God would also be able to derive everything that would ever happen anywhere else in the universe. Right? That sounds a little nutty, right? It sounds a little batty, but let's continue to try to stay with it. Let's continue to try to stay with it. Why would Leibniz say this? Well, Leibniz would say this because if God knew that Penelope would be recording for her early modern class on this specific day, right? Then that would also require that God knew, that uh, that the University of New Mexico exists, right? And it would require that God knows that human beings need to eat, right? Because he would know why it is that I decided to record after lunch instead of before lunch, right? And then God would know specific biological facts about human bodies, about why it is that we need to eat, because God doesn't know unclearly why human beings need to eat. He knows with absolute clarity and absolute distinctness why every single human being needs to eat the exact amount that it does, right? And so, in virtue of knowing, you can sort of draw out these inferential chains, right? And Leibniz's point is we all exist in the same universe, right? And that sounds like a crazy person thing to say, right? It sounds completely obvious, but think through the implications of it, right? For Leibniz's conception of God, for Leibniz's God to know all of these facts about Penelope, right? God would also then have to know all of the facts about everyone watching this video, right? That they were students, right? Who watched it because they were a member of this course during this particular time, right? And then from there, God would be able to derive everything about everyone you know, and then everything about the human race, and then everything about physical facts related to the human race, and then those physical facts and their implications for the astronomical sciences, right? And then all of the physical laws of the universe, or he could choose to go in a completely different order, right? The point is that by virtue of existing in the same universe, there's a sort of coherence about the properties or predicates that I can have and the predicates that everyone else can have, right? And while it can be very unclear, for example, how perhaps like the relationship between, say, me and then you as the viewer, your close friends, right? There's seemingly no connection at all, right? But if you were God, you would be able to say, oh well, there's this very, very minute, incredibly small connection that you have that where you're causally related, either through you, the viewer, or someone else, right? At least one way you're connected is I use this example, right? And so there's at least one now, right? Okay, so let's get to the quote here now. So, this is what I read earlier. From God's perspective, each subject or substance contains all of its predicates or properties, right? So God would be able to know everything about me, every predicate I would ever have, when I would get haircuts, why I would do it, the length of my toenails at a particular period in my life, the exact moments of my death, the happiest moments I'll have alive, all that stuff, right? God has an absolutely perfect knowledge of all of it, right? And by virtue of having a perfect knowledge of all of that, right, God has a perfect knowledge of the universe as a whole because I exist in it, right? My properties are related to the properties of the universe. Even if there's an infinitesimally small, so infinitely small relation, right? Like, what is my relationship to, astronomical objects like Venus, right? Presumably very small, right? Like, if I were to die, Venus would not be affected. If things changed a lot on Venus, I would probably not be affected, right? But the law of continuity from the previous reading states that there's no jump in nature, right? So it's not just a binary yes or no, it's how small is that relationship, right? Because you, as a member of the universe, affect everything else in the universe, right? You belong to that giant algorithm that is the algorithm of the universe, right? This is why Leibniz has that part in the discourse about quietism, right? You might think, well, if the world is completely determined, I don't need to do anything, right? And Leibniz says, no, 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 it's completely determined and you're a part of it, right? You're part of that algorithmic sequence that makes the universe function, right? So here is the next quote, which I've written down here. And it gets a little messy at the end, so I apologize. I'll read it all out. God, seeing Alexander's individual notion or haexicity, we'll just say individual substance, monad, whatever, sees in it at the same time. So God doesn't need to move from one to the other to make it clear like we do, right? Sees at the same time the basis or reason for all of the predicates which can truly be said of him. So, as an implication, from all time in Alexander's soul, there are vestiges of everything that has happened to him and marks of everything that will happen to him and traces of everything that happens in the universe. And so Leibniz has, oh my God, it's just utterly beautiful, right? Leibniz has this image of the world where the world is completely composed of these individual monads, right? Their individual perspectives on the entire whole, right? That contain in them virtually everything about the entire universe. And, you know, Leibniz says that they cohere just like different viewpoints on a city, right? And so everywhere in the universe is composed of these tiny, infinitesimally small, minute perceptions of what the universe is like, right? And even though they're radically different at times, right? Just like my perception of the universe is radically different than a microorganism's, for example, they all manage to cohere, right? They are all images of the same universe, right? And so they all fundamentally agree with one another. And where they differ is merely in the kind of perspective that they're able to have. So like you and me, you, the viewer, and me, the person recording, we have different perspectives about the universe, right? Certain things are more or less explicit to us, but we each are seeing the same thing, right? Which is the same one universe, the best universe, the one that we happen to live in. And so that's what a monad is. There are an infinite number of monads because they're the very stuff that the universe is composed of, right? They're the things that every body is made of, right? And they each have their own perspective on the universe. None of them are able to sort of like say everything about the universe all at once, right? So we each have sort of partial perspectives on the whole thing, right? Whereas God would be that entity that's able to survey all of them simultaneously, right? And at every level of scale. Yeah, kind of crazy stuff. So monadology, the monad, which we shall discuss here, is nothing but a simple substance that enters into composites. And so the monads are, he says, the atoms of nature. They're the ultimate stuff of which everything is composed of. And he conceived of them as having an infinitely small magnitude, amount of space that they took up, right? So they would begin to take up space in composites, but individually they take up none, right? And so monads differ in the quality of their perceptions, right? And to illustrate that, you can do it kind of formally, like you would, like, in a math class or something like that. And I am not an expert, okay? So I apologize for any novice mistakes that I make, right? So Leibniz says that every monad contains ultimately everything that happens in the entire universe, right? And so what that means is you can't differentiate monads by their properties or their predicates, right? Because they all have all of the predicates of everything in the universe, right? Well, you can differentiate them, and Leibniz is clear about this in the Monetology by the quality of their perceptions, right? And Leibniz has in mind here, there are microorganisms that have very, very limited sense capacities, right? There are vegetables, right, that maybe have more complex information systems, right? There are animals that have sensations, right? And then there are human beings or spirits which not only have sensations but can reason, right? And so what this does is it allows us to bring different parts of the universe into more or less clarity. And this is what differentiates monads from one another. So you can think about each monad as like a set that contains everything in the universe, right? But you can think about the order, the ordinality, right? Is that right? The math people will have to correct me if I'm wrong. But you can think about the order of what is contained within the set, right? So, like, as an example, I've written P here for me for Penelope, and I've written J here for my wife, Jasmine, right? And so you can think about it as like we each contain, right? That's what this symbol means, I think. In set theory, is you're referring to what a set contains, right? And then, it'd be filled with an infinite number of things, namely everything in the universe, right? But you can think about the order, right? So, like for me, I spent a bunch of time thinking about early modern philosophy, right? So, early modern philosophy would be relatively early in the order, right? Whereas my knowledge of biology or set theory, as this example, right, is much lower, right? So, that'd be towards the end. Or here I've written like art. Like, I don't know very much stuff about art a lot of the time. However, you can think about another set that would also contain all of the same stuff, right? But do it in a different order, right? So Jasmine, she actually does love philosophy, but she doesn't love early modern philosophy, so that would be towards the end, right, of her set. Whereas it'd be very early on in mine, right? And so every monad contains virtually the entire universe, right? But only some of them are able to express this with clarity, right? And are able to like we each kind of see like our own small portion of it with clarity, right? The perspective that animals have a certain kind of clarity that I can't access, right, as a human being. For example, dogs' sense of smell is much more clear and distinct than mine, right? And so, Leibniz conceives of a kind of hierarchy of monads, right, where some of them have more capacities than others, some of them see more clearly, distinctly than others, right? And this is the way that we access the noumenal, the way that the world really is. That's what noumenon means, is the actual nature of reality. Each monad has a limited dimension of their access to it, right? They can be differentiated from one another by the content and the quality of their kind of knowledge. We can create distinctions between qualitatively different kinds of perception, right? And so, yeah, that gives us a pretty clear picture, I hope, of what Leibniz means by monads. And so I think that what other concept this begins to help us to appreciate is Leibniz's notion of the pre-established harmony. And this is essentially what I've been referring to whenever I've talked about the algorithm of the world, right? This sort of imagery, right? For Leibniz, a lot of the time, right, what he is going to sort of say to certain kinds of philosophical problems is he's going to say that there's a pre-established harmony to the universe. One way of expressing this idea is through the principle of sufficient reason, right? Everything is the way that it is for a reason, right? And different types of explanations work in different domains. So, for example, Leibniz says teleological kinds of explanation, when we're appealing to the purpose of, the creator, Leibniz says that works great for doing metaphysics, right? Why is the world the way that it is? These are the sort of questions that metaphysics can ask and answer, right? Why is there gravity rather than not? That's not the sort of answer that is properly posed to a physicist, Leibniz believes, right? Leibniz thinks that metaphysics answers teleological ways of approaching are appropriate in metaphysics, but they're not appropriate in physics, right? And then similarly, efficient causal relations, right? Um, the bump and grind of bodies against each other, right? That works perfectly at the level of bodies, but does not work at all at the level of substances, right? And so the mind-body problem becomes a problem about how it is that the level of bodies coheres with the level of metaphysics or minds or, teleology. And Leibniz's answer to that question is, well, there's a pre-established harmony to the universe. And that's what explains how those two things cohere. Why do they cohere? Because it would be more beautiful for them to do that, right? It would be a better universe than one where they didn't. And you would need some sort of explanation for why they didn't cohere, right? Similarly, why is it the case that, two monads, why is it that their perspectives cohere? Well, ultimately, it's because they're looking at the same universe, right? They're looking at the same stuff, right? The same things that are contained in these little sets, right? But they see it from two different points of view or perspectives, or they're ordered differently, right? And so that's what Leibniz sees the pre-established harmony has sort of like a solution to a lot of epistemological problems. It's like, well, how can we know about the world? Well, the world is ordered, right? That's how we can know about the world. It solves these problems in metaphysics, right? What is the relation between God and his creation? Well, God set up his creation in a perfect harmony with one another. Why is there dissonance? Well, the same reason that there's dissonance in music, right? That it's necessary in order for there to be higher harmonies, right? And Leibniz makes this sort of metaphor with music very explicit, right? And then it also becomes a solution to the mind-body problem, right? Why is it that at the level of minds, at the level of substances, at the level of monads, there's a correspondence with the world of bodies? Well, because that world would be better, right, than a world where they didn't. And so I hope that this video on Leibniz's notion of substances or monads has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing your reactions. Thanks always for your hard work in my class. I appreciate it. Have a good week.